Hello, book lovers! I'm Rachel Barenbaum, author of the novel Atomic Anna, and you're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. Check This Out is a series where I interview emerging and diverse authors you may not have discovered yet. A series brought to you by New Hampshire Public Radio and our brand new partner, the Penn-Faulkner Foundation. Penn-Faulkner administers major literary awards and public programs, including the Penn-Faulkner Award for Fiction. We have a lot of really exciting books and authors coming your way this spring. Next week, I talk to Callan Wink about his brand new book, Beartooth. Tune in next week for that interview. Today on the show, my guest is Olivia Wolfgang-Smith, and we are discussing her brand new novel, Mutual Interest. Mutual Interest is set in turn-of-the-century Manhattan, and here turn-of-the-century means early 1900s. The book is about marriage and ambition, sexuality and secrecy, and the true cost of building an empire. Mutual Interest is focused on Vivian and Oscar. They're both new to Manhattan and on the fringes of high society. Vivian is broke, shunned by her parents, and has no real way forward when we meet her until she encounters Oscar. His career and personal reputation are also on the verge of disaster. But when Vivian spots him gambling and drunk, she sees the spark of a kindred spirit and thinks they might just be able to save each other. They need saving, not just because they're facing financial ruin, but also because they're both closeted and feeling the pressure to hide their true selves. Together, they enter into a lavender marriage, a marriage where they both know the other is gay, where they both hide each other's secrets, and that's just the first half of the book. We haven't even talked about how Vivian becomes a captain of industry. I loved this plot, and I could not get enough of the narrator. The voice in this book is unbelievable. Olivia Wolfgang-Smith, I'm so excited to have you here on Check This Out today so we can discuss your beautiful brand new book, Mutual Interest. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I'm so excited to be here.
So, Olivia, Publishers Weekly describes Mutual Interest as a novel focused on the private lives of three queer misfits turned business titans. What a description! How do you describe this book?
I do love that description. I describe it usually as a queer Edith Wharton pastiche. That's like how I start with it to try to cover everything. So like New York City, turn of the century. We're a novel of manners primarily, kind of a love story, social satire. And yeah, to bring in the business piece of it, this is a book about people with jobs in addition to everything else they have going on.
And underlying it all is this lavender marriage. Can you just explain that to everybody?
This is, in this book and in general, a lesbian and a gay man. Those are the terms that they would probably use today to describe themselves, although they're in the turn of the 20th century. So these labels don't come up so much. But they have this sort of marriage of convenience in order to protect themselves from societal suspicion and to be able to explore personally and professionally without too much undue notice.
So we have the Gilded Age setting, right? We have industry, we have queer love. In some way, that's the surface level description. What would you say this novel is really about underneath all of that?
I tried to get a little bit of everything in there, so it can be a little bit daunting as a task to describe what everything is really about. I think that one way I often describe it is that it's a book about webs of influence. So about how these characters' lives unfold because of the people and events that they kind of collide with, personally and globally. So that I think is a question of like the scope and scale of the book, of how these different communities and characters are affecting each other.
So that's pretty complex. There are a lot of levels here. How did you come up with this idea? What inspired you to write Mutual Interest?
There were a couple of different roads in. I think that one of them was so the business that these characters work in together is a personal care business. That's their industry. Soap, cosmetics, candles, that sort of like aisle of the pharmacy is where they're working together. And I was inspired by the real life fact that Procter and Gamble, James Procter and William Gamble, were initially business rivals in real life. They were enemies. That was their relationship at the start of their career until they happened to marry into the same family and had a common relative kind of knock their heads together and say, you shouldn't be competing. You should be together. And I was just so struck by that kind of experience of being set up by someone and kind of took it and ran with it into a fictional space where everything was much more dramatic.
Did you have an aha moment? Were you reading a book? How did you find out about this relationship?
This was expressed to me by a family member. I think this is how I often get ideas, seeds of ideas for writing, is like little pieces of trivia that trickle down to me. The other piece of it that went into this book was actually reading a historical article that was written for second graders. It was a second grade news piece about Mount Tambora, a volcano that has kind of a big, strange job to do in this book, about how the eruption of this volcano in 1815 led to the invention of the bicycle, in a very kind of indirect path. I have aha moments like that from things that are designed literally for children all the time. I think it's just like always fascinating to learn new things about history, regardless of age level.
Okay, so do you have any kind of personal connection to this novel?
I am a New York City transplant. I think that in general, novels of manners, all of to me, as someone who has loved reading them for my entire life, are sort of timeless and easy to have a personal connection to no matter what, because they're sort of psychological and emotional portraits laid bare. So a lot of my personal connection is just about living in this city at this time of like our time of great social and technological change at our turn of the century, and being a queer person myself, and kind of finding it easy to identify and project onto this other era of history where people were kind of feeling a lot of the same things.
And why do you love the Gilded Age so much?
I think that there's a material culture to this, and so there's the Gilded Age, and then this is a little bit like like progressive era is like where a lot of the action of this book takes place. It takes place over a long time, something we haven't really talked about yet. I think that in general, I am interested in all of the ways that it feels like there are more in common between historical eras than there is difference, and like that everything that feels so new and to these characters are things like women's suffrage and the invention of the subway and things that we sort of maybe think of as constant time, like very old. But yeah, I think that it helps me understand what is maybe not so unheard of before about the eras that we are living through. But yeah, it's also just like an incredible aesthetic and a great vibe.
I mean, you really do use these enduring universal themes also of love and, like you're saying, of being a transplant, right? What it's like to move to New York City and try to sort of build your life.
Yeah, and a sense of like I think that there's like a metaphysical thing that goes into moving to any new town and not just New York, although New York loves to we love to feel exceptional about New York City. But yeah, the idea that maybe you'll be a new person or have a new life, maybe you'll not only be able to achieve something new, but also possibly outrun something that you're trying to cut out of your life, and that obviously in reality that's always more complicated on all sides.
Can you read for us?
Oh, yeah, sure. I will read a little bit from quite near the beginning. Vivian Lesperance of Utica, New York, rode her first safety bicycle on her 17th birthday. It was April 10th, 1898. Vivian wasn't pedaling. She was cupped in the handlebars like an off-kilter figurehead, stomach swooping and feet splayed, skirt knotted at the knee and fluttering. Leaning back against the braced forearms of Patience Stone, whom Vivian's parents called a tomboy, but who wasn't, because despite cropping her hair like Joan of Arc, she'd won Queen of the Snowball 2 years running. Patience Stone, Vivian thought, simply knew how to do more than one thing. This talent the Lesperances, small-minded and suspicious, could not name, and so she was a tomboy, because that at least was something they could sneer at. Hold still, Patience said, and Vivian tried. She was drunk, a birthday slug of whiskey from Ruth Thomas, her father's underpaid apprentice at Lesperance Carpentry. Tipsy, Vivian found it was thrillingly easy to lean into each bend in the road, but difficult to stop once she'd begun. Patience nudged her to the center. No such thing as a tomboy, Vivian gasped, as if continuing a conversation. Then they crested the next hill, and the ecstatic wind stole her next words from her throat.
If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. My guest today is Olivia Wolfgang-Smith, and you're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. We're talking about Olivia Wolfgang-Smith's brand new novel, Mutual Interest, and she just read to us. And we get a little piece of history and setting as we meet the characters, as we start with Vivian right there. And this was one of the things that I really loved about the book is that you weave in the safety bicycle, right? This is like a historical moment. And at the same time, you have the theme of your main character, Vivian, realizes that she can ride out of this life that she hates, go somewhere. She literally has wheels under her. So it's this great sort of metaphor or theme that you really weave into the entire book, mutual interest. Olivia, how did you think about that balance between the setting and adding in that history, threading that in, as well as the actual action of the book?
It's a really good question. I think that part of it was thinking about these sort of like global and personal stakes. So things like the invention of the bicycle were a very big global deal that had a lot of very widespread effects. The new woman as a image really came up during this time, and Vivian, the character, is very much an individual kind of example of that. So I think that there's an easiness to being a fiction writer that everything can be grounded in an individual fictional character. So I think that I was kind of careful to think about, especially during this like research process when I'm discovering all of these great new historical trends and facts and large events that happened, to be able to always make sure that I was grounding it in my individual characters and like to make sure that nobody was ever just a symbol or just an excuse for me to get at something that had happened historically.
So I'm picturing you with like a running list of cool historical facts as you're writing. Is that right?
Yeah, that's pretty right, honestly. That's not that off. And but sometimes as especially as the book progresses, like there things tend to shift. It goes from starting with like this like kind of like cloud to this like board of all of these amazing things from this time that I'm trying to like pull into a story to then once the characters kind of take on flesh and become real people in my head, it shifts and it ends up being like I need if I want the characters to have this emotional experience next, what can I research in order to help me flesh out that emotional piece.
So you like led right into my next question, which is let's flesh out these characters. Can you talk about the characters? Let's start with Vivian. So we just met her in that scene that you read. We met her on the bicycle. She's still living at home. Tell us about Vivian.
Yeah, Vivian is I've heard her described by some as sort of a proto Gatsby figure, like one generation earlier. But yeah, she's like a very ambitious and very stifled young woman who has big plans for herself, very far outside what her class and her gender would kind of lead her to be able to expect for herself at this time, being like born in the late 1800s. And then that are also kind of compounded by her specific personal life, which is that she has this very, very unsupportive family. And so, yeah, she sort of moves to New York in the sense of running away from home and ends up trying to kind of make a life for herself, essentially being homeless, kind of like finding these different girlfriends to befriend and use to climb through society.
And she's very ambitious.
Very ambitious, and in a way that is sort of, free floating at first. Like, I think that she's the like, she doesn't have a specific dream for what she wants to accomplish. She just wants to be at the top of a pyramid, whatever that pyramid might be. So because of who she meets and who she kind of like, what opportunities she identifies for herself, she ends up climbing in the personal care industry.
And at the same time that she's driven by ambition, I really get the sense that the main character, Vivian, in your new book, Mutual Interest, I get the sense that Vivian is always running away also. In a sense, she's running from herself. She's trying to hide that she's a lesbian, that she loves women. She's trying to run from her parents, hide her past there. She seems to always be running.
Yeah, I think that this is something that maybe affects more than one character in this book, but certainly affects Vivian a lot, is this sense of sort of trying to outrun or avoid a certain amount of emotional development by looking at other kinds of definitions of success and happiness in order to kind of not have to deal with certain questions. Yeah.
There are other characters also running in this book, of course, and that takes us to Oscar, another one of the main characters. Let's talk about Oscar. Introduce him.
Oscar Schmidt is a Midwestern middle manager at a soap company who has a lot of anxiety about pretty much everything in life, I guess you would say. He is gay and very troubled by that from a very young age. And yes, definitely of all of the characters trying to outrun things about themselves in this book, at the beginning, Oscar is really, really struggling with that. and has ended up in New York kind of explicitly trying to outrun himself and is fated for good and for ill to meet Vivian and to fall under her sway.
And when we meet him, he's moved to New York because he's opening up a new branch. He's expanding a self-care company. I mean, what a metaphor. And also, right, just in the heart of the historical moment. Tell us about the self-care industry. I mean, it was like a cutthroat moment, which feels funny to say that now, like the cutthroat soap industry. But it is.
This is a fascinating era for that kind of like, yeah, the self-care, personal care, cosmetics in general, especially after the Civil War, that this was something where this industry kind of like had a huge evolutionary leap forward, partly out of necessity, because the Civil War kind of like taught a lot of America how important this stuff was, how soap was sort of one of the most important tools for safety, but then also as a luxury, as a cosmetics industry, and that there's a lot of competition. There was a lot of very stiff like advertising competition. And this is where kind of still familiar to us today. A lot of the cosmetics industry, there are a lot of tools of sort of shame, of sort of like trying to suggest to us all that maybe we should look different, we should like clean ourselves differently, we should have a different kind of personal style, and that people might be kind of judging us for not using cosmetics correctly or enough. So yeah, that all goes into the sort of professional competition.
You're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. I'm Rachel Barenbaum. My guest today is Olivia Wolfgang-Smith, and we are talking about her brand new novel, Mutual Interest. We were just discussing the personal care industry. One of the main characters, Oscar, is in New York City setting up a branch of the personal care company. He's working on soap and candles. And this is how we meet a third main character, Squire. And they are competing for the materials that they need to each be in their own business. And they become bitter rivals, right? It's even covered in newspapers. It's this crazy dynamic. Olivia, tell us about Squire and this dynamic that they have at first.
Yeah, Squire is the third kind of like main character of this book, and he is like the black sheep son of a very old money New York family. So sort of like very, very wealthy, very, very eccentric. And sort of when we first meet him, he is in the process of realizing that he is too eccentric to get away with, even for a very wealthy person, I guess I would say. So he has these like, very obsessive hobbies and hyperfixations that are sort of causing a lot of social scandals. And when we first meet him, he's gotten very interested in sewers and the history of the sewer system after reading Les Miserables. So he ends up getting quite interested, almost as a again, he's very wealthy. He doesn't need to be running a business, but is interested in soap and candles and the this kind of personal care industry just as a hobby, and ends up being a great personal threat to Oscar, one of the other main characters, and causing a lot of drama and problems that way, kind of kicking off the plot of the book.
And so the two of them are, just to be very specific, they are competing for byproducts from the meatpacking industry, right?
Yes.
And because Manhattan is the size of Manhattan, right, there's only so much that they can get from the meatpacking district, and so it is this competition, like, who's going to get those materials and what's it going to be for, and so it is cutthroat and competing, and then Vivian says, "Hey, why don't you guys work together?" And it sounds like that was the genesis of the book when you were reading about Procter& and Gamble. It was also like, right, someone said, "Why don't you guys work together?"
Yeah, I think in actual fact, it was their shared father-in-law. So their actual life kind of kicked off by the fact that they happened to marry these two sisters. And I sort of heard that, and as a fiction writer, was like, "That's a fascinating tidbit. Don't tell me anymore. I'm workshopping it into this novel in this other way." But yeah, the sense of having a basically being set up in this way that Vivian sort of knocks their heads together professionally because she has financial and business ambitions. And there's this sort of unintended side effect that they fall in love. And that's the kind of fly in the ointment emotionally.
So Oscar is in the self-care business and Squire is in the candle making business. We are set in a time when New York City is really lighting up with electricity, like literally lighting up. We're moving away, and yet we're talking about candles and soap. So can you talk about that juxtaposition? And also it seems like such a symbol that we're moving towards electricity, right? And yet they're still sort of tinkering with candles.
In Squire's case, as a character, he is fascinated by candles because he just happened to read a book about them and finds like how they work to be really interesting. It is like a very impractical hobby for him on many levels. On one hand, he doesn't need the money because he comes from great wealth. But then, as you say, on the other hand, electricity is like well established at this point. And to that end, I mean, I don't think this would count as a spoiler to say that what they end up doing is sort of not quite inventing, but having a big leap forward for scented candles. To find a way to make candles into a luxury, kind of almost a cosmetic in themselves, which is possible because Squire is interested in them primarily from a chemistry standpoint anyway. So yeah, I think that they're a little bit like the entire like self-care, personal care, cosmetics industry in general. Again, like right on the line between being something practical and being something kind of silly and luxurious and very optional. That's something that all of these characters are trying to figure out, like what's the line between necessity and luxury in their personal lives, in their professional lives.
And then they end up, all 3 of them, living together. And Vivian, right, takes over, and she turns this into this massive company, massively successful, earns tons of money for them, and that's where we get to really a woman becoming a captain of industry. Tell me about that.
That was a lot of fun to write, these sort of these scenes in this section of a very interesting, I guess, to say the least, time for American capitalism, a time of much less regulation than we know now, a time of kind of like runaway innovation, of opportunity for some really like Machiavellian business practices as well. And Vivian dives in, jumps in with both feet. And is it's kind of in some ways a joy to watch her succeed, and in other ways kind of terrifying. And that she sort of gets to run this empire and sort of take this maybe problematic attitude of defining her success and her happiness by productivity and power over others and all of these kind of capitalist values, to take them to a very far extreme.
Were there any books that you read that inspired this or that helped you sort of put yourself in this place?
A lot of what I was reading was like these novels of manners. I mean, E.M. Forster's Morris is a huge part of the DNA of this book, that because that is his like kind of queer story. Edith Wharton is everywhere here. The House of Mirth and Age of Innocence are both big inspirations for this. I'm fascinated by the way that she writes about this time and place and interpersonal romantic relationships and social satire, but also there is a lot of like financial and business intrigue at the edges of her novels. And I kind of wanted to bring it into the center a little bit, talk about how these people got their money, how they keep it, and what kind of like the moral and day-to-day activities are that allow them to keep it. I also really love one of Wharton's short stories called The Other Two, about a man who kind of accidentally makes friends with both of his wife's ex-husbands, in a way that kind of like gets at the strange sort of, atypical family structures of some of these families.
If you're just joining us, I'm Rachel Barenbaum. My guest today is Olivia Wolfgang-Smith, and we are talking about her brand new novel, Mutual Interest. Mutual Interest is a stunning story that includes a lavender marriage, industry. We have a woman, Vivian, who takes over. She becomes a captain of industry. She's running a self-care company while everyone thinks that her husband is actually doing it. And through it all, I was propelled through this book. I loved it because of the voice. It is written with this omniscient narrator, and I felt like I was in this beautiful drawing room in New York City in 1900s, and, like, this woman is leaning over and whispering the story to me, like, "You're not going to believe this," and it just was so good. Can you read from your novel, Mutual Interest, and let us get a sense of that?
This is a one of these interjections from this kind of omniscient narrator that you're talking about, Rachel, that they'll sort of kind of sometimes interrupt the story to sort of have a quick aside. So this is at a debutante ball where we're in the middle of a kind of a dramatic moment with Vivian, but we kind of stop to look at her friend, Patience. We can spare a moment to watch Patience's presentation after all she has done for us. She carried herself well, charmed in the receiving line, curtsied without a wobble, came away without smudges on her kid gloves. Her escort, though not the boy she would eventually marry, was a perfectly nice young man. Whenever they crossed paths over the ensuing years, they would always remember to ask after each other's dogs by name. Patience had a fine time at Cotillion and then set off into her own story, seeing Vivian less and less as their calendars diverged. She would marry for love, keep a house in Paris upholstered in pink brocade, mother bright and ambitious children. She would also join the first Sherlock Holmes fan society, make a pilgrimage to Baker Street so excellently costumed as Dr. Watson that she would be served in a gentleman's club. Patience had a lifelong fondness for supporting roles, and so we hope we have engaged her with her blessing. For our purposes, we will leave her here. We wish her well.
Ah, I love that. That is a perfect example of the voice. It's like we're leaning over head to head, and this is patience and this is what happened. But hold on, we're just going to leave her here because we're going to get back to our story. Talk to me about how you came up with that voice. How did you write that? How did you put that in there?
I mean, it sort of it snowballed. It became a little bit of its own. The voice was so fun. I started it because, again, I was inspired by all of these sort of historical novels of manners from around the time that this is set, like written around the time that this is set in the early 20th century, late 19th century. And they all have this sort of like very intrusive, or many of them have these very intrusive, omniscient narrators in this way that have this kind of tone of like, it's not quite dishy, but, like, kind of, like, affectionate judgment of the characters, and will sort of, like, pause the action to directly address the reader and have this tone of, like, "Can you believe what's going on? Can you look at this? Look at these people. Look at the decisions they're making." And it's unusual in modern novels to have that kind of narrative voice. I had never written a book with it before. I started doing it, and I could not believe how fun it was. It was unreal. And so it became a huge joy. Some of the asides are consciously funny, some of them are very serious and are sort of, like, critiquing the characters in a really intense way, and then some of them are kind of, like, in the middle, and it's just kind of a fun way to pause the action and look at side characters, that maybe the main protagonists of the story aren't noticing, to let the reader notice them a little bit more, like that one was.
It's also sort of a way to instruct the reader of, like, how to read, right, and what to think about. So in the passage that you read, it was like, "Okay, we're going to leave Patience here, and we wish her well." Like, there's no hard feelings, but you don't really need to stick with her, right? You really, took my hand right through that book.
Yeah, yeah, it's true. You can kind of do in terms of like it helped this book, I think, have a really large scope and scale. The fact that I like had the opportunity to just sort of say, don't pay attention to that. Pay attention to this, like, and kind of like move along quickly. Yeah.
But also you could use it to give us a little bit of history, right? Where you talk about, the first Sherlock Holmes fan society, right? And do these kinds of things. So did you get pushback on this or did they want more of it? Was that going through editing?
I think that it's so intrinsic to this book that there was no world where anyone would have been excited to work on this book, but not excited to work on the voice. Like it's the thing that drives the book. So no, it was fun to collaborate, and yeah, it like to add more. Thing is, there is no natural stopping. Like with that much omniscience, you really have to decide when the story begins and ends. Because if it could like it'll exist throughout all of space and time, and you have this like genuinely omniscient narrator who knows everything, yeah, there you kind of have to decide when you're going to stop. But that was a collaborative effort for sure.
I also want to talk about how you use this omniscient narrator to bring historical context, but also to really tell us about the characters themselves, because I just couldn't get enough. I loved it.
I'll read this paragraph, sure. Mr. Clancy was well accustomed to this kind of dubiously freeing transaction. In his youth, a substitute had been hired in his name to defend the Union against the Confederacy, and, as it transpired, to die in that defense at Antietam. No experience of Mr. Clancy's privileged youth or of his purchased adulthood had taught him to regret or question this exchange.
I just love that, right? Because there you put us into this moment of we're that close to the Civil War and people were paying to get out of it. So they didn't have to fight. And we've got Antietam. Like there's so much in just those few sentences because of your narrator. I just want to ask again, like, did you have to just keep going? Did you go back again and again and add more of this, or did it just come out of you?
Definitely something in between. I think that especially, like, I was learning as I drafted and then went back to edit where more information was needed. Like, in that passage, we're talking about Mr. Clancy, that's Squire's father. So this is a very secondary character, who has an important practical role in the plot of the book, but not someone who I wanted to spend 100 pages kind of getting into, the whole story of who he was and how he came to be. So I kind of was able to use the voice and use that kind of interjection to tell you a lot about him, right? The fact that's one of the few details that we learn about that character is that he paid to get out of the draft to go fight in the war. And that particular example that you called out is something that I did go back in and add in as I was working on subsequent drafts because I felt like I needed something to explain this man in a few sentences to the reader so that we could get back to the story.
Right, so you use the omniscient narrator to just tell us all we needed to know about what kinda guy he is.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that's a form, that's a craft, tool that I think is particularly, available to writers of historical fiction because we have all of this archival information and these things that will mean a lot, to readers, particularly, history buffs, people likely to be historical fiction readers.
I'm Rachel Barenbaum, and you're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. My guest today is Olivia Wolfgang-Smith, and we are talking about her brand new novel, Mutual Interest. Olivia, there are a lot of big themes in this book. I want to dive into this theme of reinvention. All three characters in this book, Vivian, Oscar, and Squire, are really reinventing themselves, but they're also reinventing the sense of what a family can be, what a home can look like. There's so many levels of reinvention. Can you talk about those levels and how you thought about them in the book?
Absolutely. That's certainly one of the main, as you say, one of the main themes of this book. One of the things it's about is this sense of reinvention, the sense of kind of like moving forward into a future and defining what that future can be, both personally and in terms of relationships and more globally. I think I thought of that as it was something that was important to me going into writing this book, is that it is historical fiction, but there are certain things that are really like emotionally and psychologically timeless. And that is something that I think that a lot of us are kind of trying to, especially like queer people, are like we're trying to navigate this kind of sense of found family and redefining our relationships against maybe what we like been taught to expect in early life, and that's something that we maybe tend to think of as a very modern concern, but it's not. It's people have been answering these questions for themselves as long as people have existed. So I think that was something that was important to me to explore with this book, as to really look at a story that made it clear that these concerns and these questions are not new, and these types of people are not new.
And also, I think that there's a fear of showing the world who you really are that is also timeless. And we see it in your characters. And in Oscar, for example, he has a whole sort of, I thought of it as a uniform, an outfit, a costume, a disguise that he puts on when he wants to go out and find a new lover or find a man that he can enjoy for the night. And it's this very elaborate scheme. And his wife even helps him with it. Or she thinks about it. And so this idea of having to hide yourself is also timeless.
Yeah, and I think that that's something that we maybe think of as a more of an older historical era, that there has exclusively been progress, and that's something that characters in this book certainly believe about their own time, that they're in this progressive era. So yeah, I think that that was definitely a two-way street. That I was thinking like, what are the ways in which eras that feel historically distant are actually much closer to us for good and for ill, in ways that are kind of scary or depressing, as well as the ways that are very inspiring. And yeah, it's been a real archival research opportunity as well.
So another big part of the progressive movement that we saw just from the fringes was the suffragettes, suffragism. And we have Vivian, who is, in my mind, she was an ardent feminist. She's running a company, she's running her life, she's doing everything on her own, away from her parents. In unions, they're sort of on the fringe. And so she has a funny relationship with them. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, I think that that is to me, a very interesting thing about Vivian as a character, and one of those ways that, like, she's not, she's not like a perfect symbol of a time, and she doesn't exist only for our eyes as modern, readers. But yes, she is in so many ways, like, very, very ahead of her time, outside of her time, in her feminism, but her feminism is a belief in herself, right? Like, that she, wants great things for herself, and she is very ambitious, and that there are conversations that she has with people who are working very hard to get women the vote, and she's like, "I don't need the vote. Look at what I can accomplish without it. You're wasting your time." She has these sort of, we might describe some of them as blind spots, we might describe some of them as more kind of dangerous and harmful than blind spots, that she is in favor of women's rights in that she is in favor of her own advancement as an individual person. And so for things like labor organization, that she has sort of outside the norm opinions in that way. But yeah, so she's a complicated person. She has some opinions that read to us as very liberal now, and she has some opinions that read to us as very conservative, alarmingly conservative.
I just couldn't believe it, her attitude towards the women's vote, right? And like, "Oh, not not really, I have other stuff to do." I was like, "How could someone like Vivian say that?" She's running an enormous empire, and she doesn't want to vote.
Yeah, but I think that her attitude is sort of, I got the empire already. I didn't need to vote to get it. That would be beside the point. So yeah, she's a complicated person, and she reaches the limits of her attitude, I guess we could say, in some ways.
Another big theme that I wanna talk to you about is loneliness. It's really expressed in your new novel, Mutual Interest, in many different ways. There's a loneliness of not being accepted into society, but also not finding love, and the loneliness of leaving your past, leaving your family, everyone that knew you as a child behind. So many different levels of loneliness. Can you talk to us about loneliness in this novel, Mutual Interest?
I think that this is certainly a book that's about people who are are wanting to be understood, wanting to find collaborators and people who we can like really commune and communicate with. And that means something a little bit different for everybody in this book, which sometimes can lead to pain and drama as there are kind of misconnections or people who are like sort of trying to connect with each other and not quite making it. Yeah, I think that there are many different overlapping versions of people who are like ending up in this very big city in different ways with different goals and different methods of trying to achieve those goals. I think that like feeling lonely, trying to solve that problem, and then also being in denial of loneliness is that these are things that kind of intersect and complicate each other.
My guest today is Olivia Wolfgang-Smith. We're talking about her brand new novel, Mutual Interest. I'm Rachel Barenbaum, and you're listening to Check This Out from New Hampshire Public Radio. Olivia, we're just talking about loneliness as a theme in your novel, Mutual Interest. And one of the things I think that reinforced this loneliness was Oscar and Vivian had very strict rules around how much they would allow themselves to see lovers or be involved with lovers. They sort of created their lives around these rules that wouldn't let other people in until they found each other and Squire. But can we talk about those very strict rules and their fear of being discovered?
So Vivian and Oscar, who again in our era they would probably use the labels of a lesbian and a gay man for themselves. They, as you say, have these kind of like very, very carefully policed sort of non-emotionally intimate relationships with their lovers that they're going out and meeting in New York City. But they have that caution and that distance for very different reasons. Where for Oscar, it's like a fear of punishment. It's a fear of being like, kind of like discovered to be having these homosexual relationships and what like negative consequences he could experience in a very real, tangible, physical way. And for Vivian, it is more of a fear of emotional intimacy and commitment with these actual women that she's seeing. So it's an interesting, it has similar surface level presentation, and then as the book goes on, things will like fork very very intensely for both of them. And that was something I was interested in the way that you can have this kind of surface level similar tactics for very very different emotional reasons.
So as we get further into the book, the three of them, Squire, Oscar, and Vivian, all end up living together. Oscar and Vivian are married, but Oscar and Squire ostensibly live together as husband and husband. And they're all under the same roof. And I felt like Squire and Oscar really found love. They found each other. And it made me feel so sad for Vivian at that point. You kept her for so long, not having love, not letting herself let go. Why did you torture her that way?
I think that it's one of those situations as you hear in sometimes in therapeutic settings that like people can only meet you as deeply as they've met themselves. So I can I'll throw that back on her a little bit. That Vivian's journey is a long one. Yeah, here that she's a little bit a victim of her own intelligence and her own manipulative skill. Vivian is such a strong person. Nobody can make her do anything she doesn't want to do. And that is a huge skill and an asset in many forms, many venues of her life. But yeah, when it comes to emotional development, when it comes to her needing to be emotionally vulnerable in order to really get to know somebody, she's not going to let anybody hurry her along that track, and she's obviously not hurrying herself along that track. So yeah, it's a longer journey for her than for Squire and Oscar, are kind of simpler folks a little bit.
I'm really struck by the way you talk about your characters because on the one hand, you're the author. You can make them do anything. right? And yet you talk about Vivian as this woman who has a mind of her own and her own journey, right? She's outside of something you can control. Can you talk about that as an author, how you think of the character and how that comes to be?
Think that in this case in particular, these three characters, Vivian, Squire, and Oscar, felt so distinct and so strong to me. Not always strong in the sense of actual strength, but so clear. It came through so clearly to me that it seemed very clear what would have been out of character for them to do. I felt like I had very clear parameters of like what these individual human beings would do in certain situations and kind of knew what to stick to in that way. They had very strong personalities to me.
I mean, in a sense, they're real people. It's like you've invented them, but actually they're real people.
For me at least when I am writing, that is how it feels. It feels like these are real people and I am kind of putting them in situations and watching how it would unfold. I know when it feels like I'm directing something in an unnatural way.
This is your second novel. Your first novel, Glassworks, was published a few years ago. How different is the second book from the first book?
That's a really good question. I think it's been a very different experience in that the first one was a very, existential kind of trial. It felt like the question with the first publication was, "What will it be like to go through publishing a book? Like, how will I feel about myself in that process?" This feels much more I'm able to focus more on the book, if that makes sense. I am less like white knuckle just feeling like, can I survive this experience?" So that is like a huge joy, honestly. It's a huge relief.
I actually read an interview that you gave when your first book was launched, and you were already talking about mutual interest. So, how long have you been working on this book?
I started writing it during lockdown in 2020. This was sort of like my project. It sort of has been like a very directly chain linked to the end of the Glassworks publication process became the beginning of this one. So yeah, that's been a real journey as well.
Can you tell us more about that connection? Like, were you writing these two books together at the same time?
The overlap was drafting on this one, mutual interest, with the sort of run up to publication, like the editing and pre-pub process for Glassworks. So I think, yeah, a little bit was that this was my sort of like generative creative space that I would go to sort of blow off the anxiety steam from getting Glassworks ready to go out the door. So that was the overlap.
And so, have you been drafting your next book in the lead up to the publication of Mutual Interest?
I have been. I've tried to challenge myself to not to take a break and enjoy this and not always be thinking of what's the next thing. But I think that what I've discovered is that it really helps me to always be to always be writing something new, kind of like meeting a new set of characters, working on a new plot is kind of helpful for me, especially in that way of like feeling less anxious focus on the parts of things I can't control. Like being in the publication process, there's less you can control. It becomes much more about the book finding its readers and vice versa. So yeah, I think that it seems that I will always be working on the next thing for better and for worse.
There's a lot of particular industry information in this book. There's also history. We're talking about the self-care industry, and it's tied to the meatpacking industry. And you must have done a lot of research. How did you do it? What kind of research did you do?
As is probably evident from reading this book, research is one of my favorite parts. It's like a real joy for me. I start with reading histories, a lot of pop histories, biographies, like when I'm in that like really exploratory phase of like not even really knowing what kind of story I want to tell, just being interested to like read around and see what grabs my fancy. But then I have a lot of fun as well going to archives and museums, these places where you're kind of looking at it's like kind of on the line between primary and secondary sources. They are very curated and like you're not just like as a layperson, I'm not a historian. Like I'm just a fan. I need that sort of like help of an archive that's been well curated. But it's a lot of fun to go and dive around. There's a big scene in this book that takes place at the New York Aquarium, which at the time was in Battery Park. And I discovered a lot of what I used there from looking in the New York Public Library archive at how that aquarium was advertised to New Yorkers at the time. And that was like a huge joy. It's just fun to poke around. I talk to friends about this and say that this book came from like a dopamine producing part of my brain in a way that was really a joy to write.
You talk a lot in the book about the subway. You really give us a glimpse into that. How did you really dig into that?
Huge shout out to the New York Transit Museum, which was a really great resource as I was going through. They've got trains from all these different eras, including advertisements on the trains for all these different eras, including a lot from the personal care industry, which was kind of trippy to see as I was going through. At a certain point, the research rabbit holes and the book were sort of influencing each other. So there is a lot about the subway in this book for that reason, that there's a lot to discover about the history of the subway out there.
What did you struggle with the most with this book, either in the publication process or the writing or the editing? What was really the hardest part in putting mutual interests together?
That's a really good question. I consider myself lucky that this book didn't have like there weren't as many like pain points. Like it felt like it came quite easily and naturally. I think maybe because as we were discussing it is very voice driven. So once I had the voice, I kind of felt like everything felt natural. Honestly, the biggest struggle is it was knowing when to stop. Like having this highly omniscient kind of voice, the narrator that knows everything about every character, about every era of history, going backwards and forwards to kind of like find the shape of the story within that was a little bit of a challenge, but a pleasant challenge.
What advice do you have for new writers?
Oh my gosh. I consider myself a new writer that like and constantly I'm like learning and iterating and that getting out there and I think that equally important to me are reading new work that's coming out, seeing everything that's out there, writing, trying to get something on the page as often as possible. Just writing for endorphins, just writing to write. And then getting out there and like we were discussing, like going to museums, going to if this is for historically interested folks, paging through archives, reading something on topics that interest you, even if you don't necessarily think that it has quote unquote has anything to do with fiction you're writing. In my experience, it often ends up like that process of discovery can be really, really fruitful.
Olivia Wolfgang-Smith, thank you so much for joining me today on Check This Out.
Thank you so much, Rachel. It's been so much fun.
I'm Rachel Barenbaum, author of the novel Atomic Anna. You've been listening to Check This Out, where we dive deeply into the works of emerging and diverse authors you may not have discovered yet. This conversation is a partnership between New Hampshire Public Radio and the Penn Faulkner Foundation. Penn Faulkner administers major literary awards and public programs, including the Penn Faulkner Award. I'll be back next week with Callan Wink. We'll be talking about his new novel, Beartooth. Our producer today is Jessica Hunt. Penn Faulkner's executive director is Gwydion Sullivan. NHPR's program director is Emily Quirk. The show is sponsored by C&S Wholesale Grocers Family of Companies, the podcast Totally Booked with Zibby, the Jack and Dorothy Byrne Foundation, and the Howe Library Corporation. Remember to go to your local library or local bookstore and check out all the books you hear about here and love. Thanks so much for listening. See you next time.